There are moments in a wedding ceremony that nobody prepares you for. Not in any book. Not in any conversation with your mother the night before. Not in 14 months of planning and dress fittings and seating charts and flower arrangements that took 3 weeks to finalize. Nobody prepares you for the moment someone stands up in the middle of your ceremony and says another woman's name. It was a Saturday afternoon in June. St. Michael's Catholic Church on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, Georgia. 200 guests. White roses on every pew. A string quartet playing something soft near the altar. The kind of afternoon that smells like candle wax and gardenias and the particular weight of a moment you have been moving toward your whole life. I was standing at the altar in my dress. Ivory. Simple. My grandmother's pearl earrings. A small bouquet of white peonies I had chosen myself from a florist on Ponce de Leon Avenue 3 months earlier. Priest had just asked if anyone present knew of any reason this marriage should not take place. It is a formality. Everyone knows it is a formality. Nobody stands up. Nobody has stood up at a real wedding in living memory. It is a line from another century that survives in the ceremony the way certain things survive, because removing it would feel like losing something even if nobody can explain exactly what. My mother-in-law stood up. Eleanor Beaumont. 61 years old. Navy dress. Pearl necklace. The expression of a woman who had rehearsed this moment and decided it was worth whatever came after. She said, "We name Patricia Ann Holloway as the rightful wife of our son. She belongs with this family. This marriage should not proceed." My father-in-law stood beside her. 200 people turned to stone. I did not move. I did not cry. I did not look at my husband beside me. I looked at the priest. Father Daniel Reyes, 50-something. 20 years at St. Michael's. A man who had presided over more weddings than he could count, and had never once in those 20 years heard those words spoken out loud by anyone who meant them. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at me. Then he opened the Bible on the altar. He turned to a specific page. He read one sentence out loud. And the 200 people who had turned to stone in that church understood in the length of one sentence that Eleanor Beaumont had made the most catastrophic miscalculation of her life. But I will get to that. First, you need to understand who Patricia Ann Holloway was, and what Eleanor Beaumont had been planning for the 14 months between the engagement and that Saturday afternoon in June. My name is Caroline. Caroline Grace Whitfield. I am 39 years old. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia in a yellow house on Jones Street 2 blocks from Forsyth Park. My father was a history professor at SCAD for 31 years. My mother taught piano and made the best biscuits in 3 counties without ever once measuring anything. I met Thomas Beaumont at a charity fundraiser in Atlanta in April 3 years ago. He was 37. Quiet. Kind of man who listens before he speaks and means what he says when he finally does. He had dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, and he brought a bottle of very good bourbon to the auction table and bid on a painting of Savannah that he said reminded him of a place he had not been but had always meant to go. I said, "I grew up there." He said, "Tell me about it." We talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the end of the evening I knew 3 things. He was the most genuinely attentive man I had ever spoken to. He had been briefly married before. 5 years ago. It had ended. He did not elaborate and I did not push. And his mother was going to be a problem. I did not know that last one from Thomas. I knew it from the way his face changed for just a fraction of a second when someone at the table mentioned his family. A tightening. Gone before most people would catch it. I caught it. I grew up in a house where my father taught history and my mother played piano, and I had been paying attention to small things my entire life. I learned about Patricia Ann Holloway 6 weeks into dating Thomas. He told me himself. Over dinner at a restaurant on Peachtree Road. He was honest about it in the careful way of a man who has decided honesty is the only way through something difficult. He and Patricia had dated for 3 years. His mother had loved her completely. When Thomas ended the relationship, his mother had taken it as a personal wound that had not healed in 5 years. He said, "I need you to know that before you meet my family. My mother has not accepted that it is over. She still sees Patricia at church. She still considers her," he paused, "she still considers her the right choice. I said, and what do you consider her? He looked at me across that table. He said, someone I cared about who was not right for me. And someone my mother has turned into something she was never actually was in order to have something to hold on to. I understood that more than he knew. I said, Thomas, I appreciate you telling me. He said, I wanted you to have the whole picture. I had the whole picture. What I did not have was the understanding of exactly how far Eleanor Beaumont was willing to go to protect the version of her son's life she had decided was correct. I found that out on a Saturday afternoon in June in St. Michael's Catholic Church on Peachtree Street, standing at the altar in my grandmother's pearl earrings. While a string quartet stopped playing and 200 people stopped breathing and a priest opened a Bible to a page he had not planned to open. Let me take you back 14 months. 'Cause what happened at that altar did not begin in that church. Began the first Sunday I had dinner at the Beaumont house in Buckhead. Thomas had warned me. He had been careful and specific and honest in the way he was careful and specific and honest about everything. He said, my mother is going to be polite. She is always polite. But Caroline, polite and welcoming are two different things, and I need you to understand that before we walk through that door. I understood it before we walked through the door. What I did not understand was the particular texture of Eleanor Beaumont's version of polite. She opened the door in a cream silk blouse and pearls she had clearly chosen for the occasion. She smiled. She offered her hand. She said, Caroline, we have heard so much about you. Kind of greeting that sounds warm until you are back in the car afterward and you realize you cannot identify a single specific thing that was said. That was Eleanor. 14 months of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and a bridal shower she organized with the thoroughness of a military operation, every detail correct, every guest list approved, every moment managed, and at the end of every single one I drove home and sat with the feeling of having been in a room where something was happening just below the surface that I could not quite name. Thomas felt it too. We talked about it the way couples talk about things that are real but not yet fully formed. Carefully. Without certainty. He said, she wants this wedding to happen. She is participating in all of it. I said, she is participating in the version of it she can control. He was quiet for a moment. He said, what do you mean? I thought about how to say it. I said, Thomas, every decision I make she accepts. But she has a way of accepting things that makes them feel slightly wrong after she accepts them. Like the acceptance is its own form of disagreement. He looked at the ceiling. He said, I know exactly what you mean and I do not know how to fix it. I said, I am not asking you to fix it. I am just telling you I see it. What I did not tell him was that I had started keeping notes. Not obsessively. Not out of suspicion exactly. Out of the same habit my father had when he taught history. You write things down because memory is imperfect and patterns only become visible when you can see them laid out in sequence. A small notebook. Black cover. I kept it in my desk drawer at my apartment on Peachtree Place. I wrote down dates. What was said. What was not said. The small things that landed slightly wrong. March 14th, Eleanor mentioned Patricia by name at Sunday dinner for the first time. Unprompted. In the context of a story about a church fundraiser. Thomas changed the subject. Eleanor let him change it but held something in her expression for 3 seconds after. For a second, Eleanor asked me if I had considered a different venue. Not because she disliked the one we had chosen. Because St. Michael's had been where Thomas and Patricia had first attended Mass together as a couple. She said it lightly. As information. April 19th, I found a photograph on the Beaumont family mantel that had not been there the previous Sunday. Patricia and Thomas at what looked like a family Christmas. Several years old. In a frame that matched the other family photos. Thomas removed it when he noticed. Eleanor said she had found it while organizing and had not thought about which photos she was putting out. I wrote it down. May 7th, Eleanor called me to discuss the wedding program. During the call, she mentioned that Father Reyes had known the Beaumont family for 20 years. That he had counseled Thomas during a difficult period. She said it without context. I understood the context perfectly. May 23rd, I arrived at the Beaumont house for Sunday dinner 30 minutes early because Thomas had asked me to come ahead while he finished something at the office. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She did not hear me come in through the side door. She was on the phone. I heard 2 sentences before she heard me. She said, Daniel, I need you to understand what I am asking. I need you to give us the moment when it comes. She heard me then. She turned. She ended the call. She said, Caroline, you are early. I said, Thomas asked me to come ahead. She said, of course. Let me get you something to drink. Daniel. Father Daniel Reyes had been the Beaumont family priest for 20 years. I stood in Eleanor's kitchen accepting a glass of iced tea, and I thought about what I had just heard, and I added it to the list of things I was holding. I did not tell Thomas that night. I needed to understand it more completely before I said it out loud. 2 weeks before the wedding, I called my mother in Savannah. She answered on the first ring. She always answered on the first ring when I called because she said she could tell my ring from anyone else's, which I had always thought was something mothers said until she proved it consistently for 39 years. I told her everything. The notebook. The photograph on the mantel. May 23rd in the kitchen. 2 sentences on the phone. Daniel, I need you to understand what I am asking. I need you to give us the moment when it comes. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Caroline, what does Father Reyes think of you? I said, he has always been warm. He married Thomas's cousin last year. He has known the family since Thomas was 17. She said, and what do you think Eleanor asked him to do? I sat with that question. The moment in a wedding ceremony when someone can stand up. Question the priest asks. The formality that survives from another century. I said, Mama, I think Eleanor asked Father Reyes to pause long enough when he asked the question to give her time to stand up. My mother said, and do you think Father Reyes agreed to that? I said, I think Eleanor believes he agreed to that. My mother was quiet again. Then she said, Caroline, call Father Reyes yourself. Today. Not Thomas. You. I said, what do I say? She said, tell him you would like to speak with him before the ceremony. Tell him you have a question about the service. He is a priest. He will see you. Father Reyes saw me the following Thursday morning at 10 a.m. in his office at St. Michael's. I brought the notebook. I told him what I had heard in Eleanor's kitchen. He was quiet for a very long time after I finished. Then he said, Caroline, I want to tell you something, and I need you to trust that what I am about to say is the truth. He folded his hands on his desk. He said, Eleanor called me 6 weeks ago. She asked me to give her a moment during the ceremony. I told her I would consider it. I should have told her no immediately. I did not, because I have known this family for 20 years, and I made the mistake of letting that history cloud what was clearly the right answer. He looked at me directly. He said, I have been sitting with that mistake for 6 weeks. He opened the Bible on his desk. He turned to a page near the front. He said, Caroline, I want to show you something. And I want to tell you what I am going to do on Saturday. The Bible on Father Reyes's desk was old. Not decorative old. Used old. Cover worn soft at the corners. The spine creased in multiple places from years of being opened at the same passages. Pages marked with small paper tabs in different colors that had accumulated over 20 years of Sunday masses and weddings and funerals and the ordinary extraordinary business of a parish. He turned to a page near the front. Genesis. The first book. The second chapter. He put his finger on a specific verse. He said, this is the passage I read at every wedding I perform. I have read it at 47 weddings in 20 years at St. Michael's. I read it immediately after the question is asked and before the vows begin. I looked at the verse. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. He said, Eleanor did not know I read this passage at every wedding. She has attended 3 weddings here in the last 4 years, but she was not paying attention to the order of service. She was paying attention to Thomas. Close the Bible. He said, what Eleanor asked me to do was pause after the question. Long enough for her to stand. Long enough to give the moment weight. He set both hands flat on the desk. He said, what I am going to do instead is read this verse immediately after I ask the question. Before anyone can stand. Before anyone can speak. The verse establishes the covenant. It names what is happening in that church on Saturday. And it names specifically the leaving of father and mother. He looked at me. He said, a man shall leave his father and his mother. I have read that line 47 times. On Saturday I will read it for the 48th time. And I believe Eleanor Beaumont will understand exactly why I chose to read it when I did. I sat across from Father Reyes in his office at St. Michael's for a long moment. Then I said, "What if she stands up anyway?" He said, "Then I will handle it. That is my church and that is my altar and that is my ceremony. I have been doing this for 20 years. I know how to hold a room." I believed him. Closed my notebook. I put it in my bag. I stood up. He stood up. He held out his hand. He said, "Caroline, I want to apologize to you. I should have called Eleanor the day she asked me and told her no. I let 20 years of knowing a family cloud something that was not actually complicated. You deserved better than that from me." I shook his hand. I said, "Father Reyes, I appreciate you telling me the truth." He said, "Always." I walked out of St. Michael's into the June morning in Atlanta and stood on the steps for a moment before I went down to my car. The street was doing what Peachtree Street does on a Thursday morning. Moving. Indifferent. Entirely unaware that a woman had just sat in a priest's office and learned that her wedding had been planned around as a stage for someone else's grief. I drove back to my apartment on Peachtree Place. I did not tell Thomas. Not that evening. Not the next day. Not the rehearsal dinner on Friday night where Eleanor sat at the head of the table in a blue dress and toasted to the future with the particular warmth of a woman who believed she still had time to change it. I did not tell him because I needed him to be present on Saturday without the weight of knowing what his mother had planned. I needed him standing at that altar the way he always stood, steady, present, entirely himself, without the distraction of anger or grief or the complicated love of a son for a mother who had gone too far. I would tell him after. I had decided that in the parking lot of St. Michael's on Thursday morning. After. Saturday came warm and clear the way June mornings in Atlanta sometimes are before the heat settles in for the afternoon. I got dressed in the bridal suite at the Biltmore on West Peachtree Street. My mother was there. My matron of honor Sarah, who had been my closest friend since sophomore year at Georgia and who knew everything because I had told her everything Thursday evening over the phone. Sarah had said, "Caroline, are you sure you don't want to tell Thomas?" I was sure. She said, "And you trust Father Reyes?" I trusted Father Reyes. She said, "Okay. Then we go." We went. Church was full when I arrived. 200 people in the pews. White roses. The string quartet. The particular smell of St. Michael's that I had noticed the first time Thomas brought me here, and that I had associated ever since with the specific quality of light that comes through old stained glass on a summer afternoon. Thomas was at the altar. He turned when I came down the aisle. His face when he saw me was the only thing I looked at for the entire walk. Not the guests. Not the flowers. Not Eleanor in the third row on the right side in her navy dress and pearl necklace sitting with the stillness of a woman conserving herself for something. Just Thomas. The ceremony began. Father Reyes moved through it with the ease of a man who had done this 47 times. The readings. Prayers. The particular rhythm of a Catholic wedding mass that has its own gravity regardless of what is happening in the pews. Then he came to the question. He looked out at the congregation. He said, "If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." He did not pause. In the same breath, he opened the Bible. He read, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." His voice was steady and unhurried and filled that church the way voices fill old stone buildings. Completely. Without echo. Eleanor was on her feet before he finished the verse. She had been waiting for the pause that did not come. She stood anyway. She said, "We name Patricia and Holloway." Father Reyes raised his hand. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just raised it the way a man raises his hand who has been in charge of rooms for 20 years and understands that authority does not require volume. Church went absolutely silent. He looked at Eleanor. He said, "Mrs. Beaumont, covenant has been spoken. A man shall leave his father and his mother." That is what we are witnessing today. That is what this church holds. He said it gently, but with the full weight of 20 years and 47 weddings and a Thursday morning conversation in his office behind every word. Eleanor stood for 3 seconds. 3 very long seconds. Then she sat down. Her husband put his hand on her arm. She did not look at Thomas. She did not look at me. She looked at the floor in front of her, and she sat with whatever she was sitting with in the particular silence of a woman who had prepared for a moment and found the moment had been prepared for first. Father Reyes turned back to the altar. He looked at Thomas. He looked at me. He said, "Shall we continue?" Thomas looked at me. His eyes were steady, completely present, entirely his. He said, "Yes." We continued. If you have ever walked into a moment that someone else had planned against you and walked out the other side still standing, drop a comment right now. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me how you held yourself together. Because I want to know. The reception was at the Biltmore on West Peachtree Street. For hours after Eleanor Beaumont stood up in St. Michael's Catholic Church and sat back down in 3 seconds, we were in a ballroom with 200 people eating dinner and drinking champagne and dancing to a band that played something beautiful and entirely unaware of what had happened at that altar. Or perhaps not entirely unaware. 200 people had been in that church. 200 people had watched Eleanor stand. 200 people had heard Father Reyes read that verse and raise his hand and say the covenant has been spoken. People noticed. Of course they noticed. They just did not know what to do with what they had noticed at a wedding reception where the bride and groom were dancing and the food was good and the champagne kept coming. So they did what people do. They talked to each other quietly and watched Eleanor at her table and decided to let the evening be what the evening wanted to be. I danced with Thomas for 3 songs. I danced with my father, who cried through the second one and apologized and cried through the third one anyway. I danced with Sarah, who held my hand during one slow song and said into my ear, "You are the most composed human being I have ever known in my life." I said, "I will fall apart later." She said, "I will be there when you do." Thomas and I did not talk about his mother during the reception. Not because we were avoiding it. Because there was a reception happening and 200 people and a band and champagne, and we had just gotten married, and some things deserve their moment before the harder conversation begins. We gave the evening its moment. The harder conversation began at 11:47 p.m. in our hotel suite on the 14th floor of the Biltmore, with the Atlanta skyline outside the window and my grandmother's pearl earrings on the nightstand, and the particular quiet of a room after a very long day. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed. He had known something was coming since the moment Eleanor stood in that church. He had held himself steady through 4 hours of reception with the particular discipline of a man who understood that some conversations have their correct time, and this was not yet it. Now it was. I told him everything. The notebook. The photograph on the mantel. May 23rd in the kitchen. 2 sentences on the phone. Thursday morning in Father Reyes's office. The verse. The plan. He listened without speaking. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Inside, the Atlanta skyline did what it always does. Indifferent. Glittering. Entirely itself. He said, "You knew before the wedding." I said, "I knew Thursday." He said, "And you didn't tell me." His voice was not angry. It was something more careful than angry. The voice of a man processing something in real time that had too many layers to process quickly. I said, "I needed you at that altar the way you always are. If I had told you Thursday, you would have spent 2 days carrying it, and I did not want that for you. I wanted you present. I wanted you exactly as you were when I walked down that aisle." He looked at me. He said, "What was I like when you walked down that aisle?" I said, "You were exactly yourself. Teddy. Present. You looked at me like I was the only thing in the room." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were the only thing in the room." Another silence. He said, "Caroline, my mother stood up in our wedding." I said, "I know." He said, "She planned it. She asked Father Reyes to give her the moment." I said, "Yes." He put his face in his hands. Not crying. Just the gesture of a man holding something that is too heavy to hold with just hands. He stayed like that for a while. Then he looked up. He said, "I have to call her." I said, "I know." He said, "Tonight?" I said, "That is your decision. Not mine." He looked at the window. The skyline. The particular midnight quality of Atlanta seen from 14 floors up. He said, "No. Not tonight. Tonight is ours. She has taken enough things. She does not get tonight. He reached over and took my hand. He held it. We sat on the edge of that bed for a long time without speaking. At some point I leaned against his shoulder. At some point he put his arm around me. Outside the city kept doing what cities do at midnight. Moving. Lit entirely indifferent to what was happening on the 14th floor of one of its hotels. Inside the room was very quiet. Quiet of two people who have just been through something and have decided together without saying it out loud that the something is finished and what comes next is theirs. Thomas called Eleanor the next morning. I was not in the room. I sat on the hotel balcony with a cup of coffee and the Atlanta morning and whatever the Atlanta morning felt like offering, which was warm air and traffic sounds and the distant sense of a city deciding to begin again. The call lasted 51 minutes. When Thomas came out to the balcony, he sat across from me. He looked like a man who had just put something down that he had been carrying a long time. Not lighter exactly. Just different. The way you stand differently after you have finally set something on the ground. He said, she is not well. Not physically. Emotionally. She has been holding on to Patricia as a symbol of something she cannot name, and she has been building towards Saturday for months, and now that Saturday has happened and it did not go the way she planned, she does not know what to do with herself. He said, I told her that what she did in that church was something I am going to need a long time to understand. That it was a choice she made deliberately that hurt both of us. That it is not something I can simply accept and move past. I said, what did she say? He said, she cried. She said she was sorry. She said she did not fully understand what she was doing until Father Reyes raised his hand and she was standing there and 200 people were looking at her, and she realized in that moment what she had actually done. He looked at his coffee. He said, I believe that part. I think she built toward it so gradually that she did not see the full shape of it until she was already inside it. I said, what happens now? He said, she is going to see someone. A therapist. She agreed to that this morning. And she and I are going to take a long time finding our way back to something that works. If we find it. He looked at me. He said, Caroline, I need to ask you something. I said, ask. He said, the notebook. The things you noticed and wrote down. You were doing that for months while I was telling myself it was going to be fine. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I thought about how to answer honestly. I said, because I did not want to be the woman who came between a man and his mother based on feelings I could not yet prove. I needed to understand what I was seeing before I said it out loud. He was quiet. I said, and because I love you. And I did not want to hand you something painful until I knew the full shape of it. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, I should have seen it myself. I have been seeing it my whole life and I kept telling myself it was just her way. I said it was her way. That does not make it acceptable. It just makes it complicated. He nodded. We sat on that balcony until the coffee went cold and the morning fully arrived and Atlanta was entirely itself around us. Then we went inside and ordered breakfast and ate it in bed and talked about our honeymoon, which was 10 days in Portugal starting the following morning. Not about Eleanor. Not about Patricia. Not about the notebook or the Thursday morning in Father Reyes's office or 3 seconds of a woman standing in a church. Just breakfast. And Portugal. And what we wanted to do on the first day. Some things deserve their moment. We gave it ours. Portugal was exactly what we needed. 10 days of Lisbon and the Algarve coast and the particular quality of light that belongs to a country that has been facing the Atlantic for 1,000 years and has developed a certain peace about it. We walked. We ate. We sat on terraces above the water with glasses of wine and talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. Thomas did not call Eleanor from Portugal. Not once. He said on the second evening with his feet on the terrace railing and the Tagus River below us, I have spent my whole life managing her feelings at the expense of my own. I am taking 10 days. I said, take them. He took them. We came home on a Sunday afternoon. Atlanta in July. The particular heat of it meeting us at the airport doors like something that had been waiting. The work of what Eleanor had done waited with it. Did not resolve quickly. These things do not resolve quickly, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not been through one. Thomas and Eleanor began seeing a family therapist together. A woman named Dr. Angela Pierce, whose office was on Peachtree Road. They met every other Thursday for 7 months. I did not attend those sessions. That was between Thomas and his mother and whatever they needed to work through in a room with someone trained to hold it. What I knew of those 7 months I knew from Thomas. Eleanor talked about Patricia. About what Patricia had represented. Not Thomas's happiness. Her own. The version of her son's life she had decided was correct and had been holding on to for 5 years because letting go of it meant admitting she had spent 5 years wrong. Dr. Pierce apparently said, "Eleanor, you are not grieving Patricia. You are grieving the story you told yourself." Thomas told me that on a Thursday evening in October, sitting at our kitchen table in the house we had bought together on Virginia Highland Avenue, he said, "I think that is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about her." I said, "It might be the most accurate thing anyone has said about most grief." He looked at me. He said, "When did you get so wise?" I said, "I had a good father who taught history and a mother who played piano and never measured anything, and I have been paying attention my whole life." He laughed. His real laugh. The one I had fallen in love with at a charity fundraiser over a painting of Savannah. Eleanor came to our house for the first time 4 months after the wedding. A Sunday dinner. Thomas cooked. Roast chicken. Roasted vegetables. A good bottle of wine he had been saving for something. She arrived at 6 p.m. She was wearing a gray cardigan and flat shoes and none of the armor of the woman who had sat in the front pew of St. Michael's building toward a Saturday that did not go the way she planned. She stood in the doorway of our kitchen. She looked at me. She said, "Caroline, I owe you an apology that I have been trying to find the right words for since June." I said, "Come in, Eleanor." She came in. We sat at the kitchen table while Thomas finished the chicken and she told me what she had been working toward in 7 months of Thursday sessions with Dr. Pierce. She said, "I built a story. About Thomas's life. About what it should look like and who should be in it. And I held on to that story so tightly that I stopped seeing what was actually in front of me. A son who was happy. A woman who loved him honestly. A marriage that was real." She said, "I stood up in that church because I had been building toward it for 14 months and I had convinced myself it was the right thing to do. And the moment Father Reyes raised his hand, I understood in a way I had not understood before that I had been catastrophically wrong." She looked at her hands. She said, "I am sorry, Caroline. For all of it. The photograph on the mantel. The Sunday dinners. The things I said about the venue. And for June. Especially for June." Kitchen was quiet around us. Thomas had stopped moving at the stove. I looked at Eleanor Beaumont. 61 years old. Gray cardigan. The woman who had stood up in my wedding and sat back down in 3 seconds and lived with that for 4 months. I said, "Eleanor, I appreciate you saying this. It matters." She said, "I know it is not enough." I said, "It is a start." She nodded. Thomas put the chicken on the table. We ate dinner. It was not easy exactly. Not warm the way Sunday dinners are supposed to be warm. But it was honest. And honest is where things begin. The notebook lives in my desk drawer on Virginia Highland Avenue. 2nd drawer. Right side. Behind a box of paper clips and a spare charger I never use. I do not take it out. I do not need to. Did what it was built to do. I started it because my father taught me that patterns only become visible when you can see them laid out in sequence. I kept it because something in Eleanor's kitchen on May 23rd told me I was going to need it. I was right. But I want to say something about that notebook and what it actually cost to keep it. Cost me something to pay that kind of attention for 14 months. To write things down in the particular careful way of someone who is building a picture they hope they are misreading. To drive to Father Reyes's office on a Thursday morning with a black notebook in my bag and tell a priest that I believed his parishioner had asked him to participate in dismantling my wedding. That is not a small thing to carry. I carried it because I did not have another option that felt true to who I am. I am my father's daughter. I pay attention. I write things down. I do not panic. I wait until I understand the full shape of something before I speak. And I am my mother's daughter. I show up. I make the right call at the right moment. I trust the people who deserve trust and I do not apologize for noticing when someone does not. Father Reyes sent us a card on our first anniversary. It arrived on a Saturday morning. Thomas opened it at the kitchen table. He read it and handed it to me without saying anything. Father Reyes wrote to Caroline and Thomas, 1 year. May the covenant hold as it was spoken. With admiration and joy. Father Daniel Reyes. Thomas said, he really did handle that well. I said, he handled it exactly right. Thomas said, what did you say to him on Thursday that made him change his mind? I said, I told him the truth. The whole truth. And I trusted him to do the right thing with it. Thomas looked at me across the kitchen table. He said, that is what you do with everyone. I said, it is the only thing I know how to do. He said, it is enough. It is more than enough. Outside on Virginia Highland Avenue, the Saturday morning was doing what Saturday mornings in Atlanta do in June. Warm already. Getting warmer. The particular quality of light that belongs to a city in summer that has made its peace with the heat. Inside the kitchen smelled like coffee and the chicken Thomas was planning to make for dinner that evening. The notebook in the second drawer. My grandmother's pearl earrings on the nightstand upstairs. A card from a priest who had raised his hand at exactly the right moment. And a husband at the kitchen table who looked at me like I was the only thing in the room. I did not do it for revenge. I did it because of who I am. 'Cause I pay attention. 'Cause I write things down. Because when something matters I show up with the truth and I trust the right people to know what to do with it. That is enough. It has always been enough. Drop a comment right now and tell me what time is it where you are tonight. And tell me, have you ever walked into a moment someone else had planned and walked out still standing? Tell me how you held yourself together. 'Cause I read every single comment. And I want to know who else has been there. If this story moved you, if you felt that altar moment or that Thursday morning or that Sunday dinner 4 months later, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Honor Unveiled. We will see you in the next one.